I'm Hank Fairmouth, traditional pastor for Faith Formation, and it's wonderful to see you all for this second session of our Lenten series this year. Tonight we continue our Lenten series on a 60-year history of our congregation. This week we will look at the second 15-year period, a very active period in our ministry and our identity, from 1970 to 1988. Now, in reviewing the church newsletters and annual reports, what happened in this period from developing from our mission identity and engagement in the late 50s and 60s changed us into who we were to become. Building on our activism surrounding the civil rights era, we engaged in regular and powerful social activism. At the same time, we tended to the needs of our growing number of families with young children and youth and aging parents. We had an early sandwich generation here. It's kind of interesting. At the end of this period, we embraced a new name, a new sense of self, and our first interim ministry period in the life of the church. Projector's going to sleep. Strauss and Howe call this generation the Nomads. Nomads are born during an awakening, a time of social ideals and spiritual agendas. When young adults are passionately attacking the establishment and institutional order, Nomads grow up as an underprotected children of this awakening. Coming of age as an alienated, post-awakening adults, they become pragmatic in their midlife leaders during a crisis, an age of resilience in the post-crisis elders. Now that's a lot of words to say, look, we grew up in the 50s and 60s, and we had a lot of things we had to work out. And we worked them out here in progressive, life-changing ways. This definition fits well with our adolescent church, now 15 years old, as it grows into its early servant adulthood and encounters the life and identity-forming moments of transition, of loss, and of birth. From the awakening of the civil rights era into the changing American society of the 70s and 80s, the congregation weathered the crises and responded to where God was calling them. Interesting. Their answer to who was neighbor? The whole earth, the whole of creation, every person that they encountered on the way. Now, over this period, our congregation seemed to have several special focus fronts. First, our social justice. After the Poor People's Campaign, we got highly involved in housing here in Fairfax County, in D.C., and throughout the United States. We also started standing up for Native rights, women's rights, and anyone who we found to be oppressed. Second, we took on a tremendous motion in congregational life. We loved the arts. There was a long-held series of artists, advocates, and agitators. How fitting for us. Major music programs, both here in the church as well as community outreach events. Pilgrim Youth Fellowship grew into a juggernaut of youth ministry, as well as having something called plus or minus 30s, which meant everyone. Yes, and we have to embrace in the same time the name change, the retirement of the founding pastor, the longtime associate pastor. But really this time was about the internal community building, especially embracing this growing number of new families. There kept being mentioned in the newsletters about how many people hadn't been here more than 2 years or more than 3 years at each of the annual meetings. I think if we turn around and look at the congregation today, we can kind of witness that same thing. While some have been here since the beginning, many have only been here a couple of years. This period also contains the largest time of growth in the congregation, numerically. As these families came into our congregation, into the area, they also brought a variety of political ideologies and religious backgrounds. It was a time of finding again what it was to be present. Our work after the Resurrection City never stopped. In our newsletter, we say the first purpose of the Poor People's Campaign was accomplished, to make poverty visible. The major purpose, though, has yet to be fulfilled. The alleviation of poverty's scourge and the positive creation of forces to overcome its existence in the fields of employment, healthcare, housing, education, and equitable welfare. Housing and economic justice were a regular monthly article in the newsletter. We shared in special housing projects here in the county, with missions all through the county, several different home building programs. We shared in an economic development corporation with minority investment in D.C. Now, those who know that history know that in the end, that program did not come to fruition. But many churches, ours included, put cash and sweat equity into making that happen. We also took on what we would call today the school-to-prison pipeline. Yes, even in 1971, this new Jim Crow was working well. We shared an activism with community ministry in Fairfax County, arguing for fair practices in incarceration, means for prisoner reentry, judicial and penal reform, all because it's our neighborhood. There's a wonderful article about how bad the jail was and what we needed to do as communities of faith to stand with those people who are incarcerated so that they can be rehabilitated. But that's not all. On the eve of the 45th Academy Awards, Marlon Brando announced that he would boycott the ceremony and send someone in his place. A little-known actress, then president of the National Native American Affirmative Image Committee, Shaheen Littlefeather, accepted the award in his honor. To the surprise of the Academy and the assembled guests, she took the stage and said, "I'm representing Marlon Brando this evening, and he asked me to tell you that he very regretfully cannot accept this very generous award, and the reasons for this being that are the treatment of the American Indians today by the film industry." Brando wasn't alone. At the same time that this happened, our congregation got involved in the UCC's Council for American Indian Ministry, participating annually in activism and fundraising related to the wider church's work in rectifying 300 years of oppression that, yes, began at Plymouth Rock when we landed there. That slide's out of order. Peacemaking. In the 1969, we began discussing the ABM, its pros and cons. Nike missiles dotted the landscape. Anti-ballistic missiles opened our passion for peace with justice. This entree into the excess of militarism in the 70s helped shape our participation through the 1980s in the formation of peace workshops, partnerships, and ultimately the creation of the United States Institute of Peace. Now, this was formed with the help of many in the United Church of Christ, and many churches in our community stood behind it. I can't see that slide. Oh, human sexuality. That's the Stonewall March. When the time came in the late 70s and 80s, we stood with our gay and lesbian brothers and sisters, affirming their full humanity and their fitness to be accepted into Christian ministry. To be honest with history, it would take more time for us to embrace our friends, some of our friends, and understand that this call to justice extended to the bisexual and transgender communities as well. With our United Church of Christ friends, we ordained Bill Johnson in California and Ann Holmes here in the Potomac Association. Don't tell her I stole this picture off of Vanderbilt Student ID. Hey, she put it on Facebook. We reflected on human sexuality with our youth and our young adults long before Our Whole Lives or any program like it existed. We risked and challenged the church as a whole to affirm the God-given gifts within the LGBT community as the foundations were made for the Open and Affirming Resolution in 1985. And we were never one to forget our roots and our own social gospel. When the anti-apartheid movement began, we were there with it. As far back as 1968 and all the way till it ended. We organized workshops, movie viewings. We stood with South Africa, with our partner churches there, in the hope that they too would know freedom and peace. The slide that was missing, Barbara, was the one about Phyllis Schlafly. Phyllis Schlafly focused opposition on the Equal Rights Amendment and traditional gender roles. such as only men should do the fighting in wartime, how shocked she would be today by our military.
Yeah.
In Illinois, her activists and used traditional symbols of the American housewife. They took homemade bread, jams, and apple pie to the state legislatures with slogans like, "Preserve us from a congressional jam, vote against the ERA sham." And I'm a mom and apple pie. Others, like those in our congregation, had a slightly different view. In May 1968, Women's Fellowship disbanded as our members sought to work across the board for change in the gender role playing field. In 1971, then chair of the deacons, Owen Thomas, reported that the board recommended the inclusion of women, not as deaconesses, as deacons, removing a social level within the playing field of ecclesial format. One of our first female deacons is here tonight and will be sharing with us shortly as well. This week we gather to hear the stories firsthand of our own social gospel, our own witness as we grew up into this adolescent church. And I don't think we were too troubled in our adolescence, but we definitely liked making our parents sweat a little bit. So today we welcome those who lived the history. Two groups of people, those who were adults during this time, and those who were children, who are still with us. So we welcome Barbara Allen, Owen and Meg Thomas, Dottie Lamb, Ann Park, Bunny Jones, Clark Bile, Mary Summers, Hugh Beckwith, Kathy McCrae, and if they get here, Jan and Dave Curtis. Come on up. Yes, you were.
They all left tonight.
Now, I warned you guys on the crib sheet what was going on tonight, so I hope you came with a good story to tell. Each of you shares a unique point in this church's history and vision of the future. So feel free to share. There's a microphone at each end. If you want it, just call out for it and pass it on down. You've got about 5 minutes or so to share what you need to tell all of these people about growing up and being present here in the church.
My husband and I joined the church in the spring of 1970. We had just come from 10 years of a struggling church on Capitol Hill that ended up as a mission church trying to serve the neighborhood. And after Martin Luther King was assassinated, a year after that, the church doors closed, and that was the end of Ingram Memorial Church. So we came here having been recommended by our pastor. We love the architecture, we love the music, and I love people. Not all the ladies did not wear hats, so more informal form of dress. Very shortly, we were put on committees. My husband was put on the committee of missions, and one of the members of that committee lived only 2 miles from us, and she did not drive. 17 miles, I don't know how Thelma Morris ever came to the church, but she did, and so my husband picked her up and brought her back for 3 years and got to know Thelma very well. And Thelma was very interested in the American Indians. When she died, she left her house, which was the main part of her estate, to Elam College and Little River. And a committee was formed on how we should use this money that we received. And my husband was put on that committee, and they recommended, she believed in hands-on missions. So that's what the Thelma Morris Fellowship is all about, hands-on missions. I was appointed to the Board of Christian Education, and we had 2 ministers and professional organist and professional choir director, but no professional help on Christian education. Why was this? Each annual meeting for 3 years, I got up and requested money for the Board of Christian Education to have some professional guidance. And finally, we did. A very small amount to start with, but we had 2 ministers, but neither one of them was responsible for Christian education. Beck was the administrator and the preacher, and Skip was the evangelist and did PF, but nobody did Sunday school. And we had one of the first jobs of the Christian education was to recruit teachers for 2 sets of Sunday schools, one at 9:30 and one at 11. So that was a lot of teacher recruitment every year, and that was the main job of the Board of Christian Education.
I may be a young'un, but I came to the church in the fall of 1973 when I graduated from college and moved to Northern Virginia. My history is that my dad was a UCC minister, and Skip Dickinson had been an intern for him in Vermont. And my parents said to me, well, you know, go look up that church. Well, I was living over near where Pan Am's shopping center is now, so it wasn't very far. So here I ended up, and I ended up singing in the choir for quite a number of years. A couple years later, somebody showed up in choir, and yeah, 74, I guess. Yeah. Anyway, we've been married for 37 years. Yes. We were married here in the sanctuary. We had 3 pastors participating in the service because we had my father-in-law, my father, and Skip. When Stanley was born, this was in '84, he had 3 pastors helping with the baptism. One story I want to tell is that when Stanley was an infant, there was no child care provider consistent. It was all volunteers. And the first annual meeting that Stanley attended, he was 11 months old, or just about a year old. And he slept through it on my lap. And it wasn't too long after that we decided that it was time to have a paid child care person. We've had a few. Ira has since been here for quite a while now. But the concept of not having a child care person meant that things were a little different, and you needed some consistency with the children, particularly those infants, and having a consistent person. But I can remember him sleeping on my lap. Yeah, he came to choir rehearsals, actually on Sunday mornings. Yeah, Stanley was very interested in music even before he was born. What does he do now?
Hugh Beckwith. I was going to be on the previous week's panel until the weather messed things up, so I had things to say about me being a child here, and they don't apply now.
You can go back.
You stole my story about coming in after I graduated from college. One of the first things I did when I came back was come and see what the choir came in and said, anybody need a tenor? And of course they always do, so. And there are a couple of young adults in the front rows. Get to know them, and well, one I did, but she had a friend, and well, you know the rest of the story. I guess it bears saying that the music in the church at that point, I did not get a chance to look this up when Marty PQ began and ended. But this was...
Florence Lundberg was here before him, and I became the church organist in 1966. We're trying to establish when Marty PQ came, and the point of reference is that I became the church organist in 1966, And probably most of you don't even realize that at one time I was the church organist. But it was a year before my youngest child was born, so I can kind of put it in the framework. And when I came on in 1966, Flo Limber was the choir director, and then I think Marty followed her.
Yeah.
And Marty and I overlapped for about 3 years, because I think I left in 1970 as organist, and then and Marty was still here.
Oh, good,
So-
then it counts.
So that gives you your framework, your years.
Hank was referring to the arts, and this music was definitely a part of it. I don't know if this was talked about last week, but Marty PQ was a young man who had majored in 4 woodwind instruments in college and gone to the military, played military bands, and like many military musicians in this area, he got a church job. He grew up a Roman Catholic, Polish Roman Catholic, and things were a bit different in this church than he was used to. And my father was very good about not spilling beans about things, but he would hint every once in a while. Had another wonderful meeting with Marty. He just, oh, we get to do that? Oh, we don't have to, do you think it would be okay if we sang this music? And of course the encouragement, yeah, go for it. Every once in a while there were someone who had to be, oh, Marty, have to rein this in a little bit. But there was tremendous enthusiasm. He was the kind of person that when I was afflicted with changing voice, 8th grade or whatever it was, walking down the hall here, you're not in the joyful noise. Come on, and he kept pestering me until I joined. My senior year, the joyful noise had a little band. I was the pianist, and they were sitting over where the organ pipes now are. And the senior choir, as it was then called, was singing some major work on an anniversary Sunday or an art Sunday. And he says, come on over. I hadn't rehearsed this thing. Middle of the service. Well, half a minute later, I was over there reading off of somebody's music. The art Sundays were for a while, it started as choir Sunday, but it became art Sunday. There were booklets made with poetry and prose. There were paintings and sculptures that our members had done. I think it was mostly original art. People may have brought things in too. It was a tremendously creative time. And the music, the art, the whole spirit really carried things forward. This is also a time, some of you may remember the little yellow songbooks in the chairs. To complement the Pilgrim hymnal, there was this series of books. Well, that's the new one.
He said to bring artifacts, so.
All right. There was a little thing called Songbook for Saints and Sinners, or something like that. No, it wasn't. No, sorry, it was something else. Yeah, it was. I'm confusing some things. There was also a pair of pastors in New York called Avery and Marsh who were very much into making church music, worship music, popular genres and styles, and to have the words get away from the these and thous and the foursquare poetry and the very proper thoughts, and actually engage people in the world where they are. We went through, I guess, some interesting times. There's a lot of exciting, new things to sing, and also some little controversy some of it well. But it was a very active time to be in this congregation in worship and the arts.
I'm Dottie Lamb, and Herb and I joined the church Maundy, Thursday, 1964. So this is my 51st year of being a member of this church. And Herb soon found himself on the board of trustees. He was an engineer, and we were young and innocent. And we were so excited, that he's been elected to, be on the board of trustees. And we wanted to tell our parents. So, this was a big accomplishment. So, but Herb was very quiet. No, we better wait until it's actually official, and they've actually voted me on to the board of trustees. Anyway, we soon learned that being voted on the committee was pretty much automatic. Later on, he served as chairman of the building committee for the educational wing. And for some years, I had the architectural blueprints in my basement and trying to cull out my basement. I did bring them over to the church. I'm sure they're here somewhere. Anyway, as Hank mentioned, I was one of the 8 women deacons that were, we were ordained on January, I still have the bulletin, January 28th, 1971. And I copied down the names and I kind of consulted with Bunny so I would make absolutely sure where these people are and what has happened in the meantime. There are 3 that we know are deceased: Helen Baird, Daisy Crockett, and Marcine Dental. Miriam Stem lives in Annapolis, Maryland. Jeanette Wands is at Green Spring. Catherine Yeager, we don't know, unless somebody else knows. Kay Yeager. The only 2 from that class of the 8 deacons that are still active in the church are Mildred Shiver and myself. Also in that class, there were 2 men. One was Maxwell Lewis, who I'm sure is deceased. He was an older man. And Frank Schaefer, who was also deceased. After the women deacons came on board, the first runner was put down in the aisle because Beck did not like the clacking of the high heels of the women's deacons. He said, "Please don't wear high heels. Don't wear high heels." Anyway. Well, Bunny says Ron Craven didn't like it either. Well, Herb was also a member of the usher team. And if you were an usher on Sunday mornings, you folded the bulletins. At that point in the office, there was a very high, very high counter. And we folded the bulletins each Sunday morning, and you put in the inserts. Well, Herb was he was head of the usher team, and one Sunday morning he was short. And he couldn't find another person to usher. And finally he says to me, "All right, you do it. You know how to do it. You've seen it done." So I became one of the first women ushers, because up to that point, there had been no women ushers. There were only men ushers. I also found myself on the stewardship committee, and for the sake of the then committee chairman, I do not remember who it was, but I happened to be the only woman on the committee. And I was told that as such, I was to be the secretary. I was not happy about this because secretarial skills are really not my best skills. But I did stick it out, but I wasn't particularly happy about the whole thing. I also served on the Board of Missions, and I do remember One of the main topics of discussion on the Board of Missions at some point was the recognition of red china. So this goes back quite a while. I don't think this would be, it would not even be conceived or discussed nowadays. We joined in '64, and I found myself president of the Women's Fellowship in '65. So it did not take us long to get involved in the church. There were three things that I did get involved in. One was the fish program. And on the cheat sheet that we received, it was mentioned it was September 20th, 1967. I do remember going to that first organizational meeting. I do not remember whether I went on my own, because my background is in social work, or whether I went as a representative of the church. But I became very active in the fish program, and again, I can't tell you which year, but I was chairman of the fish program for at least 1 year. There were 7 organizing churches. Ours was one of the most active. We carried a full week being phone captains and drivers. I was a phone captain for many, many years. Out of the fish program, we recognized that there was a great need for low-income housing in Fairfax County, and I became the church representative to Shelter House. And that was some years ago. I have had no contact with it for a number of years, and I really don't know if that's part of home stretch now or exactly. The dedication of the shelter was in the early 1980s. The other program I was involved with was the Homeless Women Dinner Program, which was at First Congregational at 10th and G. And I used to go in at least once a month and help with the preparation of the food and the serving of the food. And all 3 of my children grew up in senior PF, junior PF, senior PF. The 2 younger children were baptized here, and not married here, but they were baptized here.
I just want to say a word in behalf of my defense of my sainted father, sainted Ron Craven. Spike, underneath this carpet, the chancel is very soft pine, and Spike heels put divots all over it.
Also for us who were the early deacons, there's a line right about, right about in the middle. And Beck taught us, come forward.
The institution. Come not as yes, not because you must, but because you may. Is that the one?
Come forward as we now serve.
Come from all things that may vary.
Yes.
Say aloud.
We couldn't hear that.
For those of us sitting over there and those of us sitting over there, we would walk to that line, and then we would turn and walk down the aisle. So I've always remembered that line right in the middle. And another little funny about Ron Craven, my youngest daughter, Ellen, had trouble keeping up her knee highs. And Ron would be, he would be the head usher, and he'd be waiting right there by the door. And he'd look Ellen up and down to make sure that those knee highs, and he would tell her, pull up those knee highs.
Well, I'm Bunny Jones, and we arrived here in Arlington, Virginia in January of 1959. And Bruce was born in October of 1959. And we attended church in the school three times. And then when you all moved in on Palm Sunday, we did the same. So we were here for a while, and then we went back to Billings, Montana, and we're at First Church there, and then came back here again with Anna Marie, who was born in 1962 in Billings, and we stayed here for quite a bit of time. Anyway, I've been back and forth quite a bit, but we started out in 1959. And as I listened to everybody else, I wrote a whole list of things down this afternoon, trying to get some continuity, what I wanted to say, but I just wrote a whole bunch of words that came to my mind. And in the early days, it was a Horizon Days camp that I helped with. And then when Meg was talking about Marty, here is the recording that we did, and Meg was the organist. So, and we did Joseph and his Technicolor Dreamcoat. We did a big black music program. And I remember Marty directing this, and we were standing in the back there, and he was trying to get us to let loose a little bit, more like the black music goes. And we weren't doing a very good job. And I remember putting the music down and leaving. I said, I cannot do this. Anyway, that was all my... Then we did the Maharaji Mass, and we had a wonderful time doing that. And we went to D.C. and did it for a couple of places over there. The name Mrs. Yingling came up. She was choir director at one time. Folly, you all. And what was Folly's name?
Nelson.
Folly Nelson. Okay, he was from Montana, and so he always had a kind of special part for me. Anyway, Florence, we remember Florence. Well, I also remember the wonderful choir parties that we had. And they were always fun over at Jane's house. And then the neighborhood parties, when that got started, that was always fun to go to people's houses and see where they lived. And even though we were scattered all over the place, we did it. The rummage sales, that was great, great fun. Being a deaconess and then becoming a deacon. And the church school staff, and I always remember Anna Marie's year 3 teacher was Peg Breeden, and she still remembers her. Meg Brickham with Parish Care. She did a wonderful job and knew all the kids, and it was great. Skip and the PF for both of my kids. They remember Skip. They did great things and had a very soft spot for him. They both joined the church at that time. The deacons' retreats, we had a wonderful time. We went to one in Maryland at a Dominican father's place in Maryland. We had another wonderful one in Alexandria, down along the Potomac, and I can't remember the name of the place, but we were there. And my job now at the welcome table started off with Helen Hawes, then Gladys Baker, and then Janet Wands, and I guess myself. Now maybe I forgot somebody, but anyway, I think it was right. And a lot of fun I had with helping Jane with the flowers. That was a whole new thing for me, and I just loved it. And we did a lot together, and the weddings, and it was a lot of fun. Then the evangelism with being on the deacons, that was fun, and I really enjoyed that. And getting the communities of cares going and doing the map that's hanging on the wall, and I hope that continues. Now I'm working on the greeters, and as I said this morning, we need some help. So I'm making a pitch right now. The women's ministry has been very interesting because we've been able to do some interesting things, and I think all of you have enjoyed it. The women have enjoyed being together for the tea parties and for other speakers that we've had. And I also have a few other things in here. Okay. When we all had young children, Alice Kasabian ran a class called Parent Effectiveness Training, and a lot of us were in it. And I'll tell you, this book looks worn, and she gave us a lot of ideas that we got through with the children. We did a pretty good job. Anyway, and then, some of you remember, the cookbooks. That's one way I think I enjoyed today going through this and remembering the people that were in the cookbooks. And then, of course, we had this one. Excuse me. And then this one was done, I'm not sure, 1975, 76. And when you look in here, here's Owen's recipe for his India chicken that I just love. And every once in a while I would say, where's the recipe? And he'd say, go home and look in the cookbook. So, and let's see, what else do I have in here? This I found is the 20th anniversary program. And this has a wonderful list of many, many things that we've done. That's, I think you had this hang too, didn't you? Yeah. And I remember when this came out, The Educational Mission of Our Church by Roger Shin. We just loved this, and we devoured this. And then I found this. This is a picture of my kids when they were young, and we were living in Annandale at the time on Cheltenham Place. And so this was when they were pretty active. So, thank you.
Well, I was going to wait until everybody else said everything and then said it's all been said. As Gary and I came to Annandale from Falls Church, and we moved into the house where we are until in 1980. So we really have come in kind of on the tail end of that time frame. And I think one of the reasons that we came to this church, besides the fact that my mother had kept encouraging us that we really should go to church or you know what will happen. And so when they would come to town or come here for Christmas, we would find a church to take my parents to. And so this one was close, and I think at that time we lived over in Homes Run Acres, and Skip lived over there. And so we knew about this church and came from time to time. And then I think we came an additional Sunday, perhaps after Christmas. And because Beck had started into a series of sermons on the entire Bible. And Gary, being the historian even then, found those extremely interesting. And so we had to keep coming back to hear all of the entire Bible series. So in any event, we kind of got started at, what did we decide with the Lingos that when we joined?
It was early 82.
Early 80s?
Early
And
82. 82.
82? Okay. And our kids were, well, Emily was in probably junior high school and was active with the PF and got more active as she was into high school. And by the time she was a senior and trying to make all those applications to all those millions of schools in New England that she wanted to go to that were all in very cold climates. And she was doing all of her work to get the applications off. And I couldn't help her with those. She had to do those. But she was also the president of the PF. And there was an event coming up, the spaghetti dinner. And that I could do. So I came over to church and with Chuck Wilford and I made spaghetti sauce for the spaghetti dinner in those gigantic pots. And some year or two after that, we were in Europe and we went to Paris and we went to a supply store. And I don't know if that piece of equipment is still back there, but we bought one of those stirring spoons, big wooden things that's about this tall. It was about 3 feet long. We had put it diagonally in the bag to get it home. But that was the one thing that I could help with the PF was to get dinner on the table. So I do have fond memories of that. And as we got more involved, I was on Christian Ed as well, and of course I was an educator, and so that seemed to be the natural fit. And after that, Beck had announced his retirement, and we were all very sad about that. And then at some point, Beck said, well, Barb, you need to be on the search committee. I said, oh, no. That's for all the really important people in the church and all of the pillars of the people. And I immediately thought of George Leonard. He was my person when I think of a pillar of the church. It's George. And so then it should all be people like George. Well, we ended up with a very interesting group of people. And I was talking with Tom Ross today at dinner time, and I think there are only 3 of us left who are still here in the church, Janie and Tom and me, who served on that search committee. And that is probably the best way to get involved in a church that I can think of, because you just, time-wise and your investment of time and energy and support for one another in a search committee, for any of you who served on a search committee, know what an experience it is and what a wonderful experience it can be. And it was, but that's really moving on into the next time frame a little bit. But that was a very exciting and empowering experience for me, because I really felt like, I always kind of, glided under the shadow of my mother, who did all of these worldly leadership things in the church and so forth. And so that was kind of her venue, and I, couldn't possibly even come close. So, but it was a wonderful experience. I think we had a very good outcome with extending a call to Vern, and I'm sure we'll hear about that in the next session as well. But I think that's my main points. We had kids in the 70s, so we were busy doing that rather than coming to church. And before that, Gary and I were downtown, and we were in the midst of all of the riots and so forth. So we've been in the DC area a long time, but we saw smoke and troops and fire and whatnot out of our apartment window, and that was a rather exciting period of time that we're very glad was behind us. So.
Okay, my family relocated here in 1968, the summer of '68, from Reading, Pennsylvania. And it was shortly after that summer, when it was some Saturday morning, my father and I were driving down Little River Turnpike, and I said, hey, look, Dad, there's a church, there's our church that we had left, up in Reading. And it was shortly after that we started coming to Little River, probably late '68 or around '69. And being 9, 10 years old, I don't have a lot of recollections to bring back about my participation in the church, but I'm glad to hear people mention the music. And that's really my memory of this church, is the fabulous music as I was growing up. My first fond memory was of probably about the time I was 10 or 11 years old, learning to sing Silent Night in German for Christmas season. And then after that, becoming a participant in the Joyful Noise. And at that time, we were so lucky to have, it was the era of the folk music, and there was so much being said at that time in the lyrics of the folk music. And the Joyful Noise would often sing some of the popular songs from that era, right there during the war and whatever. And I have a very vivid memory and fondness for singing The Sounds of Silence, Art and Simon Garfunkel. And at that time, the joyful noise, I guess it's because we had enough kids that had, there was enough of us, that we had drums, we had electrical guitars, we had all of that going on. So it made for some really, really fun time here in the church, and something very different. And then I was happy to hear, I think as Bunny mentioned, the mariachi. My entire family, we still have vivid and fond memories of the mariachi music here on, I believe, the Brown Easter season, with that beautiful brass. And they were so vivid and exciting. It really was invigorating to have a mariachi band here in the church. And so those are my fond memories of time here at Real River. Before it wasn't.
Okay, let's see. I'm going to start with a song, but I'm not going to sing it. In Christ there is no east or west, in him no south or north, but one great fellowship of love throughout the whole wide earth. Join hands then, brothers of the faith, whate'er your race may be, who serve my Father as a son is surely kin to me. And there's two other verses, but I think you get the taste of this. I'm reading this from the Pilgrim Hymnal, which is the hymnal I believe the church started with, at least it's the hymnal I grew up with. And I bring this up because when my father passed away and we were preparing his memorial service here in 1998, I said that I would like this song to be sung, and Vern said yes. And I hummed it a little bit and said, oh, we'll have to get that from the Pilgrim Hymnal. So the song, the notes behind it had changed between hymnals. So, and just as a historical point of reference, in the Pilgrim Hymnal, it describes this as a Negro melody. I don't know that if we were writing this today, the same words would be used. No. But this is the spiritual version that we had played in my father's memorial service, and it has been one of my favorite hymns through the years that I don't hear very much here. In my mother's memorial service, we also played Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, which I believe did carry forward pretty well intact between one hymnal to another. So somewhere in the time frame that we're talking about, there was a hymn change. Being a hymn book change, being a child, it wasn't my battle to fight. You know, I wasn't that aware of it, only that people seem to care about this a great deal. But it wasn't, you know, so much so for me. I guess that's the benefit of being young. Let me drop a few names, because a lot of you folks will, you might be one of them, or you will know some of them. So for Sunday school teachers, we had a couple of teachers mentioned. I'll just add to that Mr. Hartzler, who does mention that frequently. We have a special bond here, and he was one of my Sunday school teachers. Mr. Peak, who I imagine a good portion of you knew. Mr. English, and Mr. Haas. Mr. Haas was mentioned earlier. And there are others, but those are some of the, and this is a list of men, I'd just like to mention, and there were 2 Sunday schools to staff. I do seem to recall most of my Sunday school teachers were men, and there were tests. Just say. Kind of had to pick which, you wanted the 9:30 or the 11, depending on what the discipline, what the intensity of the instruction was going to be. Another reason Mr. Hartzler and I had a good bond. I'd also say that while we had a very active PF, which I wasn't quite yet into, this is a little bit younger for me, I was younger, but the Sunday schools would take the children out on outings, and we're talking about 2 full classes going on, a large group of kids, and the teachers, with I guess some help, I guess they just loaded us into the station wagons, one of the big outings every year was to go to what doesn't exist anymore. It was a Hot Shops, I think, it was in Annandale. There was another one in Bailey's Crossroads. And we would get silver dollar pancakes. Now, this was something that the Sunday school teachers did. They paid for it. And I think that's just an example of that connection, one that I cherish, having grown up with. And I did love the silver dollar pancakes, but it was a very family or familial relationship, if you will, that was still carrying forward. In the cheat notes for the history of this timeline, 1967, Fish, I think this must have been soon after Fish was formed. I remember hearing about it, and this is pretty young for me because, you know, I wasn't even to middle school yet, and I remember asking my mother if she would be my driver so that I could volunteer. Now, that was pretty ambitious for me, and I'm pretty sure I helped once or twice, and then it kind of, you know, was maybe not as practical, but, you know, the church was working its way through me in some form, so I wanted to mention that. I did know Thelma Morris. I also want to put that in. She was a lovely woman. I think she had generally auburn hair most of the time. Short, about my height. But I mean, there are people in the church, if you are involved in the church and you hear about the mission with her name on it, the fund, there are still people that knew her personally. And she was a dear person that both of my parents knew. 1970, I started into middle school. I went to Glasgow Middle School, you know, fully integrated. And Glasgow pulled from a number of different neighborhoods. And like many of the middle schools in this area, and I think I've mentioned this in other panels before, there were race riots. So this was a time period where, particularly in middle school, where your catchment area from elementary schools coming into those middle schools, you were getting really dispersed populations of people that had not grown up together. Lots of different, you know, at this time it was primarily African American and Caucasian, but other folks from other places were perhaps starting to come into the scene, but there were race riots, and I think that what I want to mention here is, while very much an introvert and not at all a courageous person, I do attribute my upbringing in this church to taking on, without thinking about it, a mediator and facilitation role. So for the teens in this group, either in the church or about to go off to college, you just never know how your upbringing in the church will make itself known, and I'm wishing you well on having your faith carry you forward. I think it helped me a great deal. The senior PF, while I was in middle school, I think this is about the right time, maybe it was a little earlier, I recollect that they staged a drama protesting the Vietnam War. And I think, thank you, you know, most of the time now I'm finding that whatever I think I remember, I'm getting cooperated somewhere. I'm not sure, maybe you can embellish on whether Reverend Beckwith was on board with it. I think so, probably. It did happen here, but I remember gigantic crosses being dragged up and down here, and it was a very visible drama kind of thing. And in mentioning this, my birth year, 1958, is one of two, I think, where there was no draft registration. So for me, I'm just below that personal impact of Vietnam, so to speak. So this seemed eye-opening to me, and it was happening here in the church. And there's a little bit of heat around it, a little bit of activism and statements from the teens in the church. So I'll let you get to that if you have some comments. Yeah. Let's see, at the same time, I think probably the time period my mother was serving coffee with Admiral Zumwalt, who was a member of the church, and I know that they had personal discussions about you know, he found people in the church that he could talk to, I'm sure ministerially and otherwise, friends and otherwise, about his role, what he had to do in his professional job. And I think this church was a wonderful place for him to find comfort, meditation, etc. It's a tough time. Yes, yes. So,
What was that, Denise?
We were just saying that Admiral Zumwalt became the chief of naval operations.
Oh, I know that.
Yep.
so confirmation class, if it was still 9th grade then, and it would have been about 1972. Name drops here would be Barb Parmenter. Parmenter's the name that some folks will know here. And Barb Matthews, I believe, was in the same class with me, so that's George Matthews' daughter. We were good friends.
If you look, the picture's in the hallway.
Yeah, we were good friends. I also, for senior PF, Lynn Kasabian and I made it, we'll say, quote, we made it through together. We had each other. It was always good to have a friend in a senior PF, so that's Brett's sister. I think she was 1 year older than me. We were more or less peers, and we enjoyed each other very much. But you also had a sense this time that the church membership was not as in this area. There's a little more dispersion. I don't have a recollection of going to people's homes. I did not go to Barb Matthews' home. I don't recall her coming to my home. It's changed from when the church started, and perhaps that's because you're at high school, and perhaps it's because, you know, it's starting to be a different church membership, you know, in terms of where people are commuting from. Also like to mention that I haven't corroborated this yet, but I really do believe Bishop Desmond Tutu came here.
Yes.
Thank you.
But if he didn't come here, they went to see him.
Yeah, I remember that, but I also think that was partly, that excitement and everything also might have been around an actual visit. I seem to recall meeting him, so we'll work on that. You know, that was around South Africa and apartheid. And then 1980, Skip and the PF, I had just graduated from college, and I mean, I was just hot off the press. I had just graduated from college, and Skip, I made the mistake of coming to church, and Skip must have had a list or something. He was organized enough to kind of, and he needed someone to help with PF. And frankly, I had never been asked to be in a leadership position in the church. And when he asked me, I just, you know, I had that moment, you know, like trustees, where I've been asked, I have to say, yes, this is an honor. Well, it turned out to be quite an honor, because I had the distinct pleasure of working with Mary Park and Emily Allen and Mrs. Hartzler's son, I believe his first name is Sean, and Kristen Hart, Miss Kay Hart's daughter. So it was quite a group, and possibly the Rogers twins in that group. And we went on Christmas caroling, which is something the church used to do. We went camping, etc. So that was quite a gift. It was a real growth period for me, and I highly, we've heard that from other PF adult leaders, what a tremendous experience it is for them. And I think I'll just close with that, except to say as a preview for the next section, Bruce and I were the first couple married by burn.
Owen and I arrived in this area in August of 1960. And we joined the church the last Sunday in February of 1961. And you probably know that Owen's parents were missionaries in India from 1928 until 1968. And there was a man named Joe Moulton who was a very strong friend of the Beckwiths. I think that you knew them in Vermont, maybe? And Joe Moulton was also a missionary in India. So when we came to this area, nothing would do but that we would look up this church and look up the Beckwith, look up back, and make the connection with this church, which we did. And so I'm delving back a bit into the 60s. But when we walked in, we had a year-old baby, year and a half old. And the nursery was in what was the old kitchen. And so amidst all of the kitchen equipment, we set up cribs. And I remember Bill Hartzler was taking care of the nursery that first Sunday. And he was so wonderful with children. And if you had a child that was crying and didn't want to be left, Bill was the one to take care of that child. Then right away, as with everyone else, we get asked to be on committees. And I remember the first one that I was on. I just have been reading letters that I wrote to my mother when I first moved here. And I was telling her about going to meetings at the church for the building fund committee. Because we had two different funds. We had the operating fund and we had the building fund. And if we were raising money to build something in the church, like another portion of the building, then we had to raise the money separately. And I was teaching school at the time, which is another aside. I taught school in Fairfax County the first year that Fairfax County schools were integrated. And I taught over on Quandra Road at a school called Bryant Intermediate. And that particular year, the way that they integrated was that there were 3 black children who came to the school, and then the next year there were 7, and the next year there were 15. And I remember that first year, there came time to be the school dance. And there was a big conversation about, well, would these children come to the dance? And if they came to the dance, who would they dance with? Would they be allowed to dance with other children? Would they need to bring their own friends to dance with whom to dance? And there were 2 other teachers, the 2 art teachers and myself. And we said, why are you making an issue of this? The children aren't making an issue of this. They're all friends. Of course they will come to the dance, they will socialize, they will have a good time. And if the adults don't make an issue out of this, then the children won't make an issue out of it. And, but it was a big thing. But ultimately we prevailed. There was a faculty of about 40 teachers, but the 3 of us took them on. And it ended happily. So the building fund was the first thing. And then I shouldn't steal Owen's thunder, but he was asked very early on to be a deacon. And I wrote to my mother, this is not something that you turn down, it's such an honor. And he felt so young because he was ordained on the first Sunday in December after our son Carl was born. And Carl was born in November of 1963. So Owen would have been 25. Oh. And he thought he was way too young to be a deacon. And then you mentioned the fact that when he was moderator, the proposal was made that we have one board of deacons. Now, I had been a deaconess. I cannot tell you how many times I came home and complained about how the deaconesses had all the SLJs. You know what SLJs are? No. Yeah. Shitty little jobs. And the deacons were these august people. So important. But if you'll excuse me for saying this, if you cut the communion bread or back, it had to be perfect. Every cube of bread had to be the same size. Exactly. They were. Yes, they were. Then, as I mentioned before, there was a need for a church organist, and I was a keyboard person, but I had only had a few organ lessons, but I decided that I surely could do the job. And I did. Is that not working?
It's working. Get
Is
feedback.
it working
You
now?
get feedback
Okay.
if they're too close together. you get feedback.
Anyway, Marty PQ has been mentioned a lot. For those of you who didn't know Marty, his name was spelled P-I-E-C-U-C-H, pronounced PQ. And Marty was a musician here in town. He also was a musician's contractor. So if you wonder why we had spectacular music programs during his tenure, just remember that he had lots of musicians from whom he could ask favors. Because he was the contractor for Wolf Trap Farm Park, it's called Farm Park, it was performing arts at Wolf Trap, and we did a lot of classical music there. And so one of the things that you did to get on Marty's good side, to be hired on the outside, was to come play for Marty at his church job. So that's one of the reasons we had so many of those spectacular musical shows during the time that Marty was our music director. And you never knew what Marty was going to throw at you. I cannot tell you how many times he would come in and say, let's do the Hallelujah chorus as the, not the recessional, but the postlude. We hadn't rehearsed it, we hadn't practiced it, but we did it. And that happened many, many times. It was a spur of the moment thing, that whatever spirit moved him at the time, that's what we did. Now, another thing that I was a part of was when I was on the committee that renamed the church. And of course it was determined that United Church of Christ would be part of the name. But then I don't remember all the ins and outs.
I'm not sure we hear this.
Now can you hear me? Yes. All right. There was controversy over renaming the church. It had been the Congregational Christian Church of Fairfax County, and that, of course, had great weight with it because of the history. And to suddenly decide that should we have another name? Should we incorporate United Church of Christ? Should it have a meaning that associated us with the locality? Or should we have some deeper meaning? And I quite frankly cannot recall exactly all the gyrations we went through, but it was controversial. I also remember working on the first pictorial directory that we ever had in this church. And and then I was on the music committee for a very long time. During that time, we hired Jan McKee. Miriam Stim was our youth choir director for a number of years, and we had 2 choirs, and we didn't have names for them. So we had a competition or a contest to see who could name the choirs, and the younger group was called the Salt of the Earth. And the reason it was called that was that for the Arts Sunday, Miriam and the children always wrote a song to be sung. And I remember the song that she wrote that particular year was about being the salt of the earth, and it ended, "Go Salt." And so it seemed very fitting that the children that she was conducting should be called the Salt of the Earth. And then the other group, the older kids, were called Joyful Noise. The other thing that I was very involved in was the purchase of the organ. That, again, was an extremely controversial thing. We had an Allen electronic organ, And of course, when you get into the relative cost of an electronic organ versus a pipe organ, and this church, of course, has had a history of not wanting to put too much money into things. So here we have, we had hired Chanson Finney as our choir director, and Chanson was extremely knowledgeable about pipe organs, and it was his dream that we would have a pipe organ. But then you have to sell the congregation on that, and they say, well, you know, we can get an electronic organ for such and such amount of money, and why isn't that good enough? And then you have to say, but you know, we've had an electronic organ, it lasted for approximately 25 years. Buy another electronic organ and it'll last for another 25 years. But then you'll have to, you'll have to go out and buy another one. You buy a pipe organ or a tracker action organ, and it's going to last for 100 years or longer. So even though it costs a lot more money, it is a wise investment, and we had to work very hard to sell the congregation on this. However, we were successful. We had fundraising for it. We raised the money. We paid for it. And we still love the organ, don't we?
Yes.
And I think it proved to be a wonderful thing. Now, I'm going to end with something that came from Vern. Owen, as you know, has been on lots and lots of committees. He's been what Vern called a pillar of the church. And he said, you know, there are pillars and there are caterpillars. And I came to the church the next Sunday and I said, well, I guess I know what I am. Owen is a pillar and I'm a caterpillar. And the explanation for that, of course, is that back in 1978, I started working evenings and weekends. So a lot of my history for the church started in 1961 when we joined, and I was heavily involved during the years that my children were young, and then once I went back to work, I became a caterpillar.
And Vern never let it down. Talking about the organ, I got notes here from when I was a moderator, from 1976 to 82. We started talking about a new organ in 1977. We finally bought one in 1982. And lots and lots of discussion went on. And we spent $100,000 on a pipe organ.
We had some people who left the church over that, I'm sure.
Couple of things I noted from when I was a moderator. We completed the addition of the new kitchen, the choir room, and the storage room. Before that, the kitchen had been up here in a relatively small space. Choir practiced.
When, do you know when that was?
76. Choir didn't have a place to rehearse, so they had the choir room. In 1976, there were 21 baptisms and 28 weddings. No funerals. Parsonage was sold to Beck for $45,000 so that he could have time to build some equity in the house. The UCC salary structure guidelines for pastors was officially adopted. We made preparations for Skip to take a sabbatical in 1977. We established a special gifts committee to look forward to an endowment process. We refinanced the building mortgage with the Board of Homeland Ministries at a very favorable interest rate. Again, in 1977, there were over 20 baptisms and weddings. We repaved the entrance driveway, but there was not enough money to pave the parking lot. Sounds familiar? Some roof repairs were made to try to solve leaks. Back to the paving of the driveway. when we first came to the church, there was another couple called the Sacketts. Roger was a very, very determined kind of person. He drove in one Sunday morning and he got stuck in the mud. And he said, "I am not coming back until you pave the driveway." But we did pave the driveway, but not the parking lot. We bought new chairs for the sanctuary in 1983. Before that, we sat in the folding chairs that are now in the social hall.
They were very cold. And noisy.
We began studying the possibility of acquiring a computer. I think for Beck, the concept of a local area network was non-existent. No computer appeared for many, many years. We sponsored an Afghan refugee family. And in response to difficulties finding people to be delegates, a delegate pool was created for attendees to the Central Atlantic Conference, the Potomac Association, and the Ecclesiastical Councils. The budget was seriously underpledged by 20% for the operating fund and 45% for the building fund. A special drive was initiated to increase pledges. I don't remember what the final shortfall was, but we had to tighten our belts. And as people have mentioned, I think I've been on just about every committee in this church. And we got into it feet first when we first showed up. And it was an exciting time. Everybody was young. And the plus or minus 30 group was everybody. And mostly under 30 at that early time. And things were happening. There was every year there were new activities going on. There was a real sense of progress and a sense that we were making accomplishments. Last night, our daughter and her husband were over for dinner, and I asked Natalie, I said, "What do you remember about the church and about going to Sunday school or church school?" Right off the top of her head, she said, "Evie Jane Davis." Evie Jane was blind, and she would have her Braille book in front of her and her seeing eye dog beside her and teach Sunday school class.
She was also a lawyer for the IRS.
She also remembered Meg Brickham as being always everywhere. And Jane Husvet's flowers, and Jane did the flowers for her wedding. Charlie Schaefer, Mr. Fix-It, woodworking, chancel furniture, the cross made from a cherry tree that was in this area before they built the building. He saved the tree. When Charlie gave his shopsmith to the church, hoping that there would be eventually a woodworking group that would use it, never happened, but Charlie frequently said, "You know, Jesus was a carpenter. We all ought to be carpenters." And Mr. Johnson, the custodian, always smiling, taking care of his church, ready to do anything that needed to be done. The confirmation class, having to take notes on Beck's sermons, difficult to follow. And the interview with the Board of Deacons prior to confirmation, scary. She says she felt very comfortable here. She still feels it's her home church and has not felt as comfortable anywhere else. In the 90s, she and Larry attended Wellspring Church to provide part of a core of early members. And her boys, who were pretty young at the time, enjoyed meeting in the firehouse, particularly when the sirens went off. There were other key individuals. Carl and Virginia Dodge. Very shortly you'll be able to see a wonderful array of azaleas going down the driveway that Carl planted a long, long, long time ago. The kitchen is Virginia's idea of what one should have as a way to bring people into the church and provide activities for outside people. Many volunteers at various work parties. We used to have an every member canvas at stewardship time. We'd go out, knock on the door of members, and talk about pledges. We did that for quite a few years. It was not a lot of people's favorite activity, but we did it. Jube Shiver, fixture at the narthex, always there to greet. So here's some of her recollections. And it's kind of interesting to sit back and talk to her about it. You know, she grew up here. They had, once their kids got into baseball and all the other sport activities, it became difficult for them to come to church very often. But she still thinks this is her home church.
Well, we talk about all the things that have gone on here, but to me, the important thing is the people. The people accomplish all of the things that we've talked about, but it's the kind of people that we've met over the years and have had association with. That, for me, is what is of value mostly.
And with that, I'm going to say thank you to you people, because it's your memories that keep this place going. Now, by my watch, it's about 5 after 7. Can I ask you for about 5 more minutes for questions? What questions do you have for these lovely panelists?
I just wanted to ask, I know in '85 with the open affirming decision with the National Church, what was the atmosphere here at Little River like for gay and lesbian people? If anybody can recall that, or maybe remember any of the conversations that went on around open and affirming at that time.
I'm not aware that it was discussed, but I'm going to go out on a big limb here. I do not know anything underneath the surface, but Thelma Morris lived with another teacher named Dorothy Self. That's all I know.
Owen says no.
I think it was a situation of everybody was welcome, but nobody talked about
Yeah, that was in the 90s.
I was wondering if any of you would recall that Ann Holmes sought ordination during, Dave and I were here from 76 to 82. And I clearly remember Ann preaching here, and then we had a congregational meeting following hearing her message, her testimony, and we voted as to whether or not to affirm her ordination to the Potomac Association, and we voted yes. So we certainly had a role in that way.
I was just going to add to that recollection that I know we went through a pretty intense year-long discussion and dialogue about whether to become open and affirming. I believe I was on the Board of Deacons when it first came up, and I was thinking, what's the issue here? And I guess we're going to get into this probably in the next stretch, but there was a very intense period of discussion and dialogue before that the vote on becoming open and affirming took place.
Not to make anybody look at their calendar, we will discuss that in 2 weeks. We discuss the last 15 years of our church's life.
I just wanted to add a comment, I guess. It brought things back when I heard comments about got involved right away. We joined in around 82 and were married in this church. And it wasn't long after that, I think somebody had it in for me. And they nominated me to be a trustee. Now, I've been chairman of the elders in my previous church. And I said, well, thank you very much. Did the trustees do what I think they do? They said, yes. I said, well, you can nominate me. And fortunately, I won. But I missed the first meeting. I had something else going on. At the second meeting, I found out I was heading the committee to modernize the church. And to bring a computer into the church. Beck was doing the bulletin on his own computer at that point. And so I went, and I heard that there was some controversy about bringing the organ in. And so having fund drives was a very sensitive kind of issue. But that certainly I would run a fund drive when I went to go ahead and modernize the church, which I did. I brought our committee, which had Roger Anderson and Doug Crone and Bob Baker and Beck and some other folks, brought in the Shepherd software and computers in the church and redid the offices. So and then after a year of weekly meetings, then I resigned as a trustee.
Several people also mentioned John Haas, and I know that one of the things that we were very much aware of with him when we first started in this church was he was very involved in taking away the sexist language from hymnals and from prayers and from other things, which is an issue nobody brought up, but it was a big issue for John.
I had a question for the panel. This is partly obviously my bias as the new senior pastor, but tonight we're wrapping up the discussion of the era of the founding pastor. Founding pastors often come, start a church, and leave in 3 or 4 years. Beck was here for a little more than 3 years, shall we say. What was your sense of the evolution of his style, the evolution of his approach to ministry as time went on?
What do you think, you?
In 4 words or less.
Yeah. Well, when we started out, his sermons were really long and boring and incomprehensible.
Let's use a mic. We're recording. Long, boring, incomprehensible. Hubert Beckwith Jr. No.
That's his son speaking. No, Beck was an intellect.
Right.
And I always remember him as being an intellectual person. And you had to really concentrate when you listened to his sermons, but there was always something there of great value.
I would also agree. I would use the same word. Reverend Beck was the intellect. Skip was the social, Beck was the intellect. But I would say the evolution is almost like he started as he was, and the message wasn't necessary. I'm sure it was an evolution, but was more like keeping pace with whatever the corroborating issue might be, the currency of the message, but the expertise and the thought process and absolutely the worship process were in place. I really can't think of dramatic shifts in the worship process, including the cute communion.
It was extremely important to Beck that the worship was a package. You know, he was very concerned about the way the worship started, the way it built, and the way it ended. And
I'd like to change the package to, he thought of it as a drama. He had early training, he was in college dramatic clubs and what, and he very much believed that the act of communicating that drama has is very important. I remember he evolved, the times evolved in the late 60s. So much more became current and possible and thought of to do in worship that had never been thought of before, and he really ran with that. Sort of not at the front of the pack, but pretty far up there.
One thing I do remember about Beck was that he said when we were wanting to have our son Greg baptized, and he had not been baptized as a baby, and we said, you know, could we do this, and what about doing it at our home? And he said, well, we really like to have it at church as being part of the service and so forth. And he said, we said, but, you know, he's older than, he's not a baby anymore and so forth. And he says, the one thing that we always do at Little, I don't know if we were Little River then or not, is always the thing that we do is the thing that whatever anyone wants to do. You know, the usual or the unusual is the usual. I think that's better stated. But I would like to say that I think that his sermons, I think to both Gary and me, always were very literary. And not only did he have a wonderful grasp of language and how best to present his sentences even, and along with his ideas and so forth. And I can't remember whether he followed the lectionary or not. I didn't, because I do remember that he had some sermons that were very current with happenings and were extremely meaningful at the time that he delivered those sermons. And I recall that very strongly, that seemed to be, it really brought today, whatever was happening at that particular time, to it, you know, with helpful thoughts to help you through that time.
Well, I remember the creativity that he brought to worship, as well as fabulous intellectual sermons. I remember responsive readings, where one side, you know, the window side and then the wall side, and I remember, I think I remember, you correct me if I'm wrong, but the Sunday after Easter, we would always sing, I am the church, you are the church, we are the church together, out of that little yellow songbook that had great sort of contemporary songs in it. So.
And that makes me recall the Palms. We always sang the Palms on.
Well, that's another memory, yes.
On the other side of his ministry, on the administrative side, it seemed as if he got more rigid as he neared his retirement. The women's group wanted to start an evening group because so many women in the church were working during the day. And he said, no, that'll never work. They went ahead and did it, and it didn't work. But there were things that he didn't want to happen, changes.
I need to close with or add a very human story about Beck, which was we became very close to Meg Brickham in her later years of life. And Meg, as you all know, was like a saint in this church. She did everything. And she also raised children by herself. She was a single parent early on. And tremendous energy. But she once said that she always hoped that Beck would notice that sometimes during the Sunday service, especially during the sermon, she would nod off and take a nap because she was working several jobs. She was doing all the things she was doing. And Beck's response, I think, summed up who Beck was. He said, listen, he said, if I can give you 15 minutes of a good nap, that's what's important for you right now in your life.
I just wanted to mention, Hugh brought this up after he saw what I brought out, but I think this is important. On the 20th anniversary, we were in this sanctuary for the dinner, and up here in front, we had the Honorable Andrew Young. And Andrew Young, of course, is a United Church minister, as a leader of the civil rights movement and close associate of Dr. Martin Luther King, was executive vice president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. He has also worked diligently for the voting rights, the peace movement, and on behalf of the working poor. Mr. Young now represents the 5th District of Georgia in the U.S. Congress. Well, he's still alive. And this program is extremely interesting. Another name that jumps out is Pat Palmer. Well, we just announced the death of Pat Palmer. Pat Palmer was a charter member until moving to New York in 1966, was moderator and chairman of both the pastoral committees. So this was quite a program. I still remember this because they were up here with the head table and all the tables, we were all in here. We'd never eaten in here before. And it was wonderful. It was a lovely evening.
Well, friends, as we approach our 60th, I'm sure we'll have another chance to eat. Maybe not in this room, but I want to thank each of you again for bringing your memories, your thoughts, your stories. You add to this tapestry that is before us in this 60 years. Thank each of you. Thank you all. Next week, there we go. Next week we'll gather again for the next 15 years.